Hey, we're back again with another section on supply, and last time when we were doing the determinants of supply, we never actually addressed number 4 here, and it's got several sub-points, and so we're going to need to go through each of those and understand them, because a lot of you probably don't have too many experience with these, and some of them might even be new words that you're going to have to learn, so we're going to get into that. It turns out that you can change supply a lot by different government policies. This is one of the determinants of demand, and it's got several subheadings. The first one is taxes. If you put a tax on something, like in our example, corn, if you put a tax on it, that causes people to have less incentive to plant the corn. So if you're going to put a tax on corn, now you've basically raised the cost of corn relative to something else like onions or potatoes or some other crop. So if it's cheaper to grow those because there's a tax on corn, farmers are going to steer away from the corn and they're going to be more likely to plant something else. And so what you've done is at the margin, okay, there's that marginal effect where the farmers that were right on the edge before, now that you put a tax on it, they drop off and they're planting potatoes. So over here, what would happen on our graph is we might be at this original supply line right here, and if you put a tax on it, you're going to move backwards to the left over to this supply line here, which means you're going to get fewer ears of corn in the market, and the ones you do get are going to come at a higher price. So there is a price to be paid for the tax. A lot of people think the price of the tax is the, $10 million collected on the price of corn. But what you also got to think of is there's two other things that are being, lost here. Because if there's $10 million collected on the tax on corn, but some of those producers are not going to plant as much corn. So you're going to lose revenue there. The price is going to be higher. Some people aren't going to buy it, so you're going to lose happiness there. Because there are people out there that say, well, I would buy corn at this price, but I won't buy corn at that price. I will substitute and go do something else. So you need to consider the true cost of putting a tax on anything. I'm just using corn because it's a very simple example. But if you put a tax on anything, you will always get less. The supply curve will move from right to left. You will get less stuff, you will get higher prices, and you will get what economists call, in my advanced economics class, we'll get into that, it's called dead weight loss, all right? There's just people that are like, I wish I could buy corn, but I can't. And I've had this experience myself. I go to the store and I'm looking at like an ear of corn for $5 in the winter. I say, well, we're not going to do that. The kids can eat broccoli. And the kids look, oh, I want corn. It's like, well, too bad because it costs too much. All right, so that's the real problem that you face here. This dead weight loss is the loss of utility or happiness that people could have. So anytime you take some policy action that shifts the curve to the side here, you're going to get unhappy people. You're going to get a loss of revenue, and that's the problem with the tax. So that's something you got to understand, okay? So don't just think, oh, just slap a tax on it, throw another tax on it. Well, the bigger the tax, the bigger the dead weight loss, okay? So keep that in mind. So taxes always shift things to the left, every time. All right, next one there. The word is a subsidy. For your notes there, a subsidy is when you pay to get more of something. If you subsidize it, you're paying extra money to get more of it. Subsidies are inherently inefficient because that's the whole point. If they had been providing what you wanted in the first place, you'd have no reason to subsidize it. But because it's not providing, there's not as much demand in the market for what you want more to be supplied than is really being asked for by the people in the market, I guess, or the culture or the country or whatever. So you have to subsidize it to get more. So there's your first dead weight loss in the case of a subsidy. They are inherently inefficient. because the efficiency of the market says this is where it should be, right here in this middle supply curve, and now we just want more of it. So we're going to move the supply curve out. So for your notes there, every time you have a subsidy, you always get more. Taxes, you always get less. Subsidies, you always get more. The problem with that is what you're doing is you're getting more of something and you're paying extra to do so. You're paying money that the marketplace says that's not efficient, but you say, well, I want it anyway, and here's an extra set of dollars, to make it happen. A classic example would be the wind towers in Oregon and Washington. They could have been built at any time. The reason they were built recently is because the states of Oregon and Washington wanted more renewable energy sources. So because of that, they offered huge subsidies to any producer willing to build those wind towers. And sure enough, several companies jumped on board and said, yeah, we'll build them. Because now what was not worth building with the subsidy, now it becomes profitable to the company and they're willing to build those wind towers. But again, there's the problem, because who's paying the subsidy? Well, the state of Oregon, for example. The state of Oregon, pays out $100,000 for every wind tower that is built. So the companies are just throwing those things up there, 100,000, 100,000, 100,000. That's coming out of the taxpayer's pocket. That's not just money coming out of the sky. So there is a price to be paid. So what you're doing in order to get those wind towers is you are overpaying the market price. That's what a subsidy is. Okay? So you will always get more. You'll move from the supply curve here out to that supply curve there if you subsidize things. The problem is they are inherently inefficient, and you're using taxpayer dollars to overpay for something that wouldn't normally be purchased in the market. If it made sense in the market and was profitable, people would already be doing it. You wouldn't need the government to subsidize it. So back to our philosophical statements we did earlier. Every time you have a subsidy, that's the idea that we need to change reality to be what we want instead of dealing with what is, or understanding what is. We're simply saying we know better than the world how to make this happen, and we're just going to make it happen, even if we have to overpay to do it. Okay? So that is a subsidy, and subsidies abound in government. School is a classic example of subsidizing education. There's way more people going to college than actually probably even should go to college, because they can't afford to go. They go into majors that don't actually pay back the money we're giving them. But because we've decided we just want more people in college, then we just say, hey, go to college and don't worry about it. And we're just going to give you some money to subsidize the loan. And that's what it's called. So if you go to college, you'll be offered plenty of options for a subsidized loan, which is at a much lower rate than a bank would actually give it to you. Because the bank would give it to you at 18%, and the federal government's going to give it to you at 6%, and it's going to be deferred for 4 years. You don't even have to start paying on it until you get out of college. The bank wants you to start paying on it the month after you get it. So that is a subsidized loan. So what do we get? We get more college people than we would normally have, which explains why we have more people flunking out of college, because they were like, should I go? Should I go? Free money, I'll go. And then they get there, they don't make it, and they're like, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So that's the whole problem with subsidizing anything. You will always get more, and you will get more in inefficiencies. Okay? Next thing there, regulations. Governments regulate things. That is what they do. Now, if they regulate things a lot, then what we have is a supply curve that shifts from our regular supply curve back this way. For your notes, regulations do the same thing as taxes. They always shift the supply curve to the left. Okay? It always goes from out here back into there. So again, you've got the same problem as with taxes. You've got the deadweight loss of people who can't get things that they want. You've got the taxpayer that has to pay a higher price here to do this. And the real problem with regulations is the taxpayer expenses. If you're going to regulate something, you have to hire someone to go enforce that regulation. You can't just say, businesses, people, just do this because I trust you, and then go away thinking they're going to do it. Now, sometimes there are laws written that way, which is really quite, hilarious. But again, that goes back to our first chapter, incentives. If you don't provide an incentive, no one's going to change. So if you want to change behavior with regulations, you've got to have someone go out and regulate that behavior. Well, they're going to need a car, and a computer, maybe an office, and some administrative staff, and the pencils and paper, and insurance, and all that, and salary, and pretty soon, you're looking at, if you're lucky, 20% overhead. Maybe only 80% of your money spent actually goes into regulating. Usually it's much more like 50. So that's, again, that kind of dead weight loss. It's not just the fact that the supply curve moves over here and you get less, which is a big part of the problem, but it's also the dead weight losses that go along with it. So understand that every time you say, there ought to be a law where they enforce some regulation, what you really just chose is, I want less. You were over here, and now you're over there. And the more regulations you pile on, the farther that supply curve is going to move up and up to the left, and you're going to get higher and higher prices. You're going to get shortages. You're going to say, well, why aren't the stores stocking this? Well, because no one wants to make it. The regulations are too high, and people just give up. Remember, if you change the incentives, you will change behavior. So if you make it harder for people to produce something, they will produce less. That's just the way it is. Okay? So you have to ask in your mind, is this regulation worth the cost? Is it worth the dead weight loss? Simply putting on taxes, subsidies, and regulations will move the supply curve around. The question is, on balance, is it worth the regulation? Certainly there are some laws that we really want to enforce, like you cannot dump radioactive material anywhere on the ground. That's pretty bad. We do not want radioactive material dumped anywhere. So we are willing to pay the price of having inspectors go out there and make sure none of that gets dumped anywhere that it shouldn't be. And so, yeah, it's going to make a higher cost, but I think on balance, we're probably going to decide that's worth it. But there's a lot of regulations, like barbers must get a license before they can cut hair. You might get an illegal haircut. And who's enforcing that? Is there some inspector going around and checking all the barbers for illegal haircuts? I mean, it gets a little strange. So ask yourself, what kind of regulations do you want and are worth it, on balance positive? And what kind of regulations can just be dropped and your society would be better for it? All right? So those are the three things: taxes, subsidies, and regulation. They will affect your supply curve in very different ways, but predictable ways. So understand that when you vote and when you ask for something. Okay?